MEA with this project. Thank you guys very much for attending this evening. My role for this is kind of to be a facilitator and note taker, so I'll mostly be in the background, just kind of taking notes and then pop in as necessary to make sure that we stay on track. A few things to cover before we get started. So today's session, we're going to start with a presentation from MEA staff. We want to make sure everybody has some foundational information around MEA's current energy portfolio, and then some info on renewables and programs that MEA has been exploring. And that presentation, we're kind of guessing will take 30 to 40 minutes or so. And then after that, we'll go into member questions. During the presentation, if you have a question that comes up as someone is speaking, feel free to type it into the Q&A or chat box. And then Jennifer, who you heard talking at the beginning of the session, she'll be kind of compiling questions that we'll answer at the end. And then we are, as Jennifer mentioned, recording tonight's session, mostly for reference. And then all the notes that I'm compiling on this session, just know that nothing will be attributed to individuals. We'll just be collecting comments kind of in aggregate and then submitting those to MEA staff and the board. So that's all the housekeeping stuff. Let's go ahead and start with an introduction of the folks that we've got speaking with us tonight. So Julie, Esty, and as I introduce you, if you just want to say hi so folks have a face to a name. Julie is the Senior Director of External Affairs and Strategic Initiatives. So Julie's.
Muted.
I think I'm muted. Hi, everyone. Great to see familiar names and faces and some new folks. So looking forward to the conversation tonight. Thanks for joining us.
And then we've got Kim Henkel, the Energy Supply Manager.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for bailing on a sunny afternoon to join us.
Ed Jenkin, our Chief Operations Officer.
Again, thank you for joining.
And
Chief
Josh,
Operations Officer for MEA in charge of engineering and operations.
and then Josh Kraft, our Grid Modernization Manager.
Good evening, everybody.
Okay, so before we get into the presentation from those folks, I believe Tony wanted to share a few words. So Tony Izzo is the CEO of MEA. Don't forget to unmute, Tony.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I appreciate you taking the time to be here and listen and share. This meeting is really a new way for us to interact with members. First of all, obviously it's virtual. We thought it important that we keep our members and employees as safe as possible with the pandemic. MEA is critical infrastructure, and therefore we are following all of the CDC guidelines to ensure continuous service. Second, I think this format is a new way for us to interact in a more informal way versus say a board meeting or something formal like an annual meeting. It allows us to provide information and get member feedback and interact with each other, I think, in a more informal way. I'll start out by just, before I turn this over to Julie, is that to emphasize the fact that this is really important to MEA as we execute on our strategic plan. First of all, the board is very interested in investigating a carbon reduction strategy. Another goal in our strategic plan is interacting with our members in a more meaningful way, especially with technology changing so rapidly and consumer needs changing just as rapidly. What we call it is strengthening our role as a trusted energy advisor is what we're trying to achieve. It's been my experience that most folks don't have a great view of their electric utility, or really any utility, when it comes to being innovative, when it comes to things like energy conservation or being in support of conservation and adoption of new technologies. This is certainly not what I'm hearing from the MEA board nor the management team. we just need to make sure that as we look at innovation, we do it in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences and is fiscally responsible to our small membership. Julie has been coordinating our team around the various topics and will be facilitating the meeting along with help from Kiera Childers. And I'm just going to pass it over to them and just say thanks again so much for being here. I'm going to go back onto mute and listen.
Thanks, Tony. And again, thanks to everybody for being here. What I'm going to do is just give a very brief overview of who we are and a little bit about what we're doing. The goal here is really to hear from each of our members, but what we've also understood as we do listen to people is we're not doing a very good job of telling people what we're already doing or what we're about. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is just share with you the things that are going on in the co-op, just to set some context. And so that's what each of the panelists will be doing. For those of you who don't know, we're a cooperative. A lot of the utilities that you hear about in the lower 48 are investor-owned utilities, but we're an electric cooperative started by Matanuska colonists in 1941. And that means that we're member-owned and member-led. We've got a 7-member board of directors. And it also means different things for us as far as what we're accountable for. And so in a lot of lower 48 cooperatives, they are led by their member-led board of directors, and that's who they answer to. We answer to our board of directors, who answers to the members, but we also are a regulated co-op. So the Regulatory Commission of Alaska oversees us, and anything we spend money on, anything that we charge money for, anything that any revenue that we bring in, it all has to go through RCA scrutiny. So they make sure that everything, one is something that either should be charged or should be spent. So that's an additional level of scrutiny that a lot of our cooperative neighbors or other cooperatives in the US don't have. We also are held to certain standards with rates compared to investor owns. For instance, like I said, any extra revenue that we have at the end can't be kind of put into whatever projects we want it to be put into. A lot of times it has to be reinvested into infrastructure or given back to our members through capital credits. So there's no profit motive. And within that, there's no extra profits to play around with in innovation. So what we do spend on innovative ideas, we need to be able to justify to the RCA. And we also need to make sure that there's no cross subsidy between members. That's a really important tenet of cooperative rate making. So we can't do something for one group of members that means that the another group of members has to pay more for. And so that's another thing that we're constantly balancing as we look at innovative ideas, is how we can make sure that it's good for all members in our membership, not just this one group of members or the single member standing in front of us. And it also means that we're protecting the investments of our members into the future. And that's the board's fiduciary responsibility. So on to the next slide. We have 52,000 members. We have over 60,000 meters, but some of members have more than one meter. And that's not a lot of members compared to how much infrastructure we have. The previous slide said, we've got 4,500 miles of power line, and we only have 52,000 members to spread those infrastructure costs over. And so that's something that we're also constantly balancing. It makes us very conservative in how we spend money, because anything we spend money on, we have to divide by 52,500 to understand the impact to our members. And it's, it's not always that easy, but it also means that things around innovation, things that can prevent infrastructure investment, additional infrastructure investment, things that may not pencil out in other places can maybe pencil out here. So in some ways it's an advantage, and in other ways it's a hurdle, but it's one of those things that we consider as we're looking at the way we manage our grid. We make power. We became a self-generation utility with the completion of EGS. You're going to hear more about that from Kim and what that did for not only MEA as an organization, but really what it did to how much less fuel we burn now because of it. And again, we're not for profit, and that is a major advantage for our members, because they're just being charged for the costs of producing their electricity. But it also means we don't have this extra money that we can spend on things that may be harder to justify to the RCA. So as Tony mentioned, we have strategic initiatives. The board came up with a strategic plan to see us into the next 3 to 5 years. Part of that is what you're seeing tonight. One of those is around collaborating with our fellow railbelt utilities. You're going to hear more from Ed about what that means, what it also means as far as fuel and cost savings, and what it may mean into the future. The board wants to explore a renewable energy and or carbon reduction strategy. And that's part of the reason why we're here, is to really understand, is that something the members want? And if we do want it, then why? And that why is a big question in what we will do to achieve. If the board does set up a carbon reduction strategy, the why is important for how we develop those programs. And so that's what we're trying to do through surveys and focus groups and listening sessions like this. Because I think, MEA has a very diverse membership, as most of you are well aware. And, but I think what we can all agree on is burning less fuel is good. And no matter where you are on the spectrum, whether cost is most important to you, or environmental concerns, or energy security, the fact that if MEA can burn less fuel, it's going to make everybody happy for various reasons. And so that's really what we're focused on in a lot of our forward-looking initiatives. And then, as Tony mentioned, just trying to interact with members in a more meaningful way. And that's really bringing this listening session. Also, we're looking at things like texting and emailing our members. That's something that people are doing all over the place, but we haven't leapt into that. So, our members have been asking for around specific programs like on-bill financing, green power donations. And as we started getting into the nuts and bolts of, could we execute that? Does that make sense for MEA? Understanding that why, as we looked at, okay, what would on-bill financing, what would we be offering that for? Or a green power program, what would the money that we would collect from our members look like? I mean, where would that go to? Those questions, we needed to understand more from our members, what they're looking for in this program. So that's what we're trying to find more information about. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the studies that we've done and what we've looked into down the road. And Jennifer, I don't know if the screen is now showing the slide. What I'm seeing is just the general PowerPoint presentation. And so I'm on our energy portfolio slide now. So just what we have right now, it's roughly 11% of our power is from renewables. Primarily that's hydro. We also have about 1 megawatt of net metering and about and we have the 1 megawatt solar farm. More applications are coming in all the time around potential independent power producers. We're very open to options around that. We also can purchase some renewable power from other utilities when it's cost effective. We've got an agreement worked out, say with Fire Island Wind, with Chugach and Eva Creek. If there's extra wind, instead of spilling it, we purchase it. And we buy and sell power. Ed's going to talk a little bit more about that. Whenever it's more efficient, if we can send our gas somewhere that can burn less fuel, we do that whenever we can. But when we are producing in our own plant, as Kim will start talking about, it's primarily natural gas is where it comes from. So on the next slide, you can also see a little bit about our unique load at MEA. And this is our winter peak. And you can see how in the curve, we kind of have this double peak. We peak early when everybody wakes up. And then because we are primarily residential, about 65% of all of our power sold is residential. So, we peak early and then people go to Anchorage and it dips down and then people come home and it heads back up. We don't have traditional big base load, big commercial, big industrial loads to kind of even out that curve. It very much dips and curves. And every load curve has some dip, but ours is pretty drastic. And that's why the EGS power plant made so much sense. And Kim will go into that a little bit as well. But you'll also see that our dips are when some of the resources are at their highest, like solar and wind. And so when our energy loads are the greatest, that's when we have less abundance of the kind of the variable power available to us. And then you can also see the next slide is summer, and it changes a little bit. And again, this was interesting because I was looking at the dates of this data, and this was in June after COVID hit. And so I think part of our load curves are starting to shift a little bit as more people are, say, telecommuting and not going into work as much. But our summer looks a little different than winter. And again, it's kind of inverse to when the sun's out, typically when the wind is blowing, although man, my wind was blowing my house for 24 hours the other day. So, but it's, we have it's kind of opposite of what's happening in the lower 48, where a lot of their load is peaks during the day in the summer for air conditioning and other cooling opportunities. But we have, kind of a traditional winter or northern utility load, but it's just more drastic, of course, being up here. So to talk a little bit more about the loads and how we serve them, I'm going to pass it off to Kim, who will, she's our energy supply manager. She works at the Eklutna Generation Station, our power plant, and she's going to go a little bit more into how we produce power. Kim.
Hey, good evening. So I'm just going to talk pretty briefly how we currently meet our member demand. If we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, Jennifer, that'd be awesome. There we go. Just as Julie mentioned earlier, about 11% of our generation is produced by renewable energy. So that includes hydro, solar, wind, a majority of it being hydro, where the remaining 89% of it is really fossil fuel generation or from natural gas. The majority of it's produced at our power plant, Eklutna Generation Station, or as we like to call it, EGS. And unlike 2020, we actually have something to look forward to in 2021. We're expected to reduce our fossil fuel generation by about 3%. We are looking forward to some additional hydro generation coming online in 2021, which we're, again, pretty excited about. We go ahead and go on to the next slide, Jennifer. So since fossil fuel generation is really the bulk of where our power is produced, I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about that. If you were to compare our carbon emissions prior to EGS and to after EGS being built, we've actually reduced our emissions by about 23%, which is pretty significant. Prior to EGS, we purchased a majority of our power from Chugach Electric from their Beluga power plant. The Beluga power plant's pretty inefficient and fairly older in the rail belt. And when we talk efficiency in fossil fuel power plants, we're really talking about how much natural gas is needed to produce 1 megawatt of power. So when you hear a plant's less efficient, it typically means there's more natural gas needed to produce a megawatt of power. So EGS is actually considered one of the most efficient power plants in the rail belt. We actually built it a little bit of a more unique design than what you typically see. So in Anchorage, their power plants are typically 1 to 3 larger units, whereas EGS is made up of 10 smaller units. And as Julie is pointing out, we have quite a bit of dips and curves in our demand portfolio or profile. Having 10 smaller units at EGS really helps us maintain efficiency at our plant while being able to follow our load. A lot of those bigger power plants can't necessarily follow loads like that. And one additional benefit of EGS of those 10 units is it's really, it's complementary to the other power plants in Anchorage by being able to follow load so well. And I think Ed, our CEO, will talk a little bit more about that in our power pooling agreement with Chugach Electric. So like I said, I was going to keep this nice, short, and sweet, so I'll go ahead and pass it off to Ed our COO, who's going to talk about the fun and exciting things we're doing with the other utilities.
Thank you, Kim. Again, as Kim said, I'm going to transition from hearing about MEA's generation portfolio to talking about how we see that working in the rail belt through other activities that we're doing with other utilities. So first of all, I was going to talk to you just a little bit about our joint power pooling. We're moving forward with the development of a power pool with Chugach Electric, and this will finalize our processes that Julie has talked about buying and selling energy. We do that on a daily basis, looking for more efficient and least cost generation. But by formalizing these processes through this agreement with Chugach Electric, we'll ensure the most efficient generation units are operating to meet the combined load of the two utilities. This is what we mean when we talk about a security-constrained economic dispatch. One entity looks at the total load of the two combined utilities, looks at the total available generation of the two combined utilities, and develops the most economic dispatch of that generation to meet the load on an hourly basis. This should result in more efficient mix of generation units being online and thereby allow us to burn less fuel, and which equates to less cost for our members and less overall emissions. We have made this agreement going forward. It's a 20-year agreement, and that also gives us some surety that as we move forward, we'll be able to plan together for future expansion collectively. One of the specifics of this long-term commitment is the sharing of our limited hydro resources. We use hydro now to really delay starts to units, to try to keep units offline as long as we can. By combining our hydro resources with Chugach, we can then keep some of the larger units offline for longer periods. This allows us to use our water resources to reduce the most amount of fuel as far as natural gas across a larger group. Another aspect of this long-term agreement is the formation of a single load balancing authority. This allows us to not only develop an efficient schedule, but operate so that we are collectively moving in the most efficient way to changes in our load as it happens on an hourly basis. And this also supports the use of renewable, or what I'll call non-dispatchable resources that's their output changes not based on schedule, but based maybe on change of wind or cloud cover over the sun. So that means that MEA units working within the single load balancing area can help to balance generation and load as wind generation in Chugach's area changes and affects Fire Island wind output. Conversely, Chugach's units will move to help balance generation to load as output from solar generation in MEA's territory may change. These activities, we believe, will save our members costs associated with natural gas and reduce by a percentage the fuel that we burn each year. Next, let's talk about other utility collaboration that we're doing, specifically associated with the development of a Rail Belt Reliability Council. Our hope is that by jointly planning ways to adjust to our future load changes and seeing load and generation requirements change, we can move more efficiently into the future if we do this through a collaborative effort. This organization, the Rail Belt Reliability Council, will do resource planning for the rail belt as the overall electric reliability organization, an organization that is being formed under the direction of the commission in the state of Alaska. Leadership associated with this organization will not just be from electric utilities, but also from state agencies, independent power producers, and consumer advocacy groups. So the overall leadership and the board of this will be balanced between utilities and non-utility groups. And the main activity associated with this group will be the development of standards, but also the development of an integrated resource plan. If through an integrated resource plan, we can more efficiently adjust to long-term changes in the demand for energy, we believe again that we continue to save money for our members and reduce the amount of fuel burned. And that's my summary on those two larger items. They're collaborative items amongst the rail belt. I'm going to turn it over to Josh now, who is our grid modernization manager, who's going to talk to you about some specific MEA projects that we have going on the rail belt.
Well, good evening, everybody. As Ed said, my name is Josh Kraft. I'm Grid Modernization Manager for Matanuska Electric. If we can go to the next slide, we're going to transition into some newer technologies and newer programs that we're exploring and trying to figure out how to work with the members and incorporate them into our portfolio. And one of the most rapidly developing technologies out there is electric vehicles. Last fall, we did an informal survey and got some very good responses. Over 800 people responded to the survey. We found out that more than 50 of our members have electric vehicles already. I know Stephanie Nowers is on and participated in some videos that we did. We also got some good information back that range anxiety remains one of the largest concerns around electric vehicles. And we followed that informal survey up with a little more scientific survey and found that about 22% of the members were interested at that time in purchasing an electric vehicle. But there's still quite a few misconceptions, I think, from early on in electric vehicle development that have hung around, and there's still quite a bit of concern. So I just wanted to walk through real quickly. There's a lot of acronyms out there. Please go to the next slide. And I just want to walk real quick through the different types of vehicles that are out there for those that may not be as familiar with the technologies. First, we'll start off with just a normal vehicle, an internal combustion engine, or ICE. And this is your normal everyday vehicle that's out there. It has a motor that turns a transmission that supplies power to the wheels. Obviously, gas or diesel are pretty typical. The transitioning to the electric world, we insert a battery into what's called a hybrid electric vehicle, or HEV. All of the power for this vehicle still comes from the internal combustion engine. So there's no electrical plug on this engine or on this car. All of the power comes from the gas engine and gets applied to the motors either via the battery, the onboard battery, which is fairly small, or from the engine itself. Next slide. We start getting a little bit more complicated. We'd go with a plug-in hybrid electric, or PHEV. And in this case, we're incorporating an electrical plug into the car itself. So in this case, we still have an internal combustion engine. We have a larger battery than the hybrid, but not as big as what we're going to go to next. And we can charge the battery either via an electrical port or via the onboard motor. And in this case, there's more than one motor for each wheel. So it gets more complex. You get a little bit of best of both worlds since you have both gas mileage and electric mileage in this case. Moving into the all-electric world, you have either, they're called a number of different things. That's why there's so many acronyms. There's the battery electric vehicle, the plug-in electric vehicle, or just electric vehicle or all electric vehicle. In this case, we have completely gone away with the internal combustion engine. There's a much larger battery. And in all of these situations, the most prevalent battery used is the lithium-ion battery. All of the power comes from from a plug and goes into the battery. The battery supplies the power to the individual motors on each wheel in some cases. If we can go to the next slide, all the last two require different levels of charging, or have different levels of charging. And when we start talking about level 1, level 2, level 3, that's just how much power you're using at each phase. So a level 1 charger is going to be it's going to be the same as like a lamp plug or your everyday plug-in. It's about 15 amps. It can take up to 12 hours to do a full charge for a battery. I think it's important to note that most of the time you're not going to need a full charge, because it's just like a gas tank. You're not going to use your full gas tank every day. You're probably not going to use your full battery every day. So in a level 1 battery or a level 1 charger, you may take up to 12 hours, but it's just a regular everyday plug. In a level 2 charging situation, it's more like a electric dryer or an electric stove, where it's somewhere around 30 to 50 amps typically, and you're going to take between 4 and 8 hours for a full charge. If we jump up to a level 3, these are commercial level, and you're not going to have these at your homes. These are going to be, again, commercial level. A lot of corridors are being installed in the lower 48 right now. And in these situations, this is much more like filling up your gas tank, where it's going to be an 80% charge in 20 or 30 minutes, but the power requirements are much higher. And we are actively engaging with various communities within our territory, with the Alaska Electric Vehicle Association, the Electric Vehicle Working Group, Alaska Energy Authority, in trying to figure out where these chargers can go and how to best serve some of our members as we move forward, as electric vehicles become more prevalent, and also helping to let the adoption of these electric vehicles move forward. I'm going to switch gears, if we can go to the next slide, and talk about our net metering program, which is a way for individual members to generate their own power from a renewable resource. It has to be at your own home or at each site. This does require an interconnection application, and does require to work with MEA just to make sure that we have the proper safety mechanisms in place. But once that happens, the homeowner is going to basically generate their own electricity, use what they can at the time, and then put the rest of it on the grid. At the end of the year, we're going to have, or at the end of the month, we'll have a net generation, and that will either be how much the homeowner has used, or how much they've generated above and beyond what they've used. And there'll be you'll either get a credit on your bill, or you'll have a reduced bill due to the generation. Right now we have over 200 active net metering members. Numbers are on your screen. It's 185 are solar and 8 other. We have quite a number of active applications moving forward as well. If we go to the next slide, this is a schematic, a basic schematic for you to get a better idea of maybe what net metering looks like. On the far left, you have a home generator. In this case, it's a wind turbine, but most often it's solar PV, and that's usually installed on the roof. But some people do install it on the ground. That power will typically go through an inverter or a converter to get the power into a usable form. That power is then used at the home as much as possible, and then put onto the grid through a two-way directional meter. And that's where we figure out how much electricity was generated at the home and how much was used at the home from the grid and to the grid. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a couple of system studies that we're going through right now, and they kind of tie into some of the renewable resource. The variable resource regulation study, you see here a data set for wind, and this goes back, if you remember the earlier slide where we have a load profile. If we have a generator that is based on this data, then we're going to have electrical generation from renewables that go up and down quite regularly. And we have to try and match that with the load that we also have going up and down. So we have to know exactly how much we are able to regulate that variable resource on the grid and fill the gaps in the generation between the load and the generation that's coming out of the variable resource. And that's why we're doing a study to know exactly how our other generation assets can work with variable generation, and we can put more of that online. Another project that we have going right now is our microgrid pilot project. And the big question is, what's a microgrid? Well, a microgrid really is any subset of a larger grid that can island and operate on its own. So in this schematic, again, this is a simplified schematic, but we have the utility grid on the far left, and then we have an open switch so that everything on the right is now operating on its own. And that means we have to have certain control infrastructure in place. We're going to have generators and possibly energy storage. And then you'll have commercial and residential and industrial loads, potentially electric vehicles. But it's a fairly complex maneuver trying to put all of those pieces into place and operate separately from the grid. Because again, it's like having a small grid within a larger grid. So you're kind of building it out. The reason that we're looking at this microgrid project is the potential to increase reliability and resiliency and efficiency at the ends of some of our longer distribution and transmission lines, where we do see potential for improved reliability and resiliency, so that we can better assess and fix faults and other issues that might happen out on those lines. And with that, I think that's the end of my slides. If we go to the next one. And I think we turn this back over to Julie at this point.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, and you guys have been very patient listening to all of our things. So I'm just going to go over this very basic and very quickly. I mentioned it earlier. We've been looking at a few different programs that our members have brought to us, and those are all still on the table. We're just looking at how they fit into this larger question about what are we trying to achieve as far as our carbon reduction and other innovations. So again, until we really put that capstone on and figure out which levers to push, we'll be then able to decide which of these we need to move forward with. Things like on-bill financing, prepaid billing, green power program. We're also doing a lot of research about innovative rate structures. So trying to help us understand how to provide member choice, knowing that our members' needs of our grid and our rate structures are starting to evolve. So how can we provide member choice while still recovering the costs that we need to for the health of our utility? So all of those are things that are definitely on the table and that we're in the midst of researching, and we can pull the trigger on as we understand our goal. So I will leave it at that, and people can ask questions further if you have them. But right now, we want to hear from you. So like I said, you've been really patient, and I know there's a lot of expertise represented in this group that's on the Zoom meeting. So whether it's questions of us or ideas for us to consider, this is your time. And again, Jennifer will be facilitating that to make sure that everybody's heard.